Hello Internet, and welcome to this video where I'm going to talk about the aptly named bloodfeast of Roskilde, part of a Danish civil war where one crown pretender invited a couple of other crown pretenders to a peace dinner, which went not well. But to start with, I'm going to give a major sort of overview over the particular situation that led up to this particular civil war and peace treaty. So, yeah, Danish history from around the year 1100. Enjoy! I have in earlier videos mentioned the powerful North Sea Empire led by the Danish king Sven and his son Canute the Great. In this particular case, however, the story takes place a bit after the fall of the North Sea Empire by the premature death of Canute. I will probably return to the North Sea Empire eventually. However, as I said, in this particular case, we start after Canute is dead. The realms that he had controlled, England, Norway, and Denmark, all had a bit of internal power struggles until about 5 years after his death, where the king Sven Estridsen, which basically means he was the son of a woman named Estrid, who was the sister of King Canute, became king of Denmark. Now, Sven was a tall, powerful, and very brave man who had in his mind to set out to recreate the North Sea Empire. Sadly, he was not the best general ever seen, and luck was rarely with him in combat. So, eventually, the division between Canute's old subordinate realms became a permanent thing, while Sven did maintain rule of the Danish core lands. Now, while Sven might not have been the greatest general or the greatest king Denmark ever had, he had one skill that no one can take away from him. He was really, really, really good at making children. And while he didn't actually seem to have had that many with his legitimate wife, he is known to have had at least 7 or 8 illegitimate sons, of which 5 became king in succession after his death, as well as a number of daughters who also contributed to the chaos of the Danish royal family after the death of Sven. The problem started very soon after Sven Estridsen died. There were 2 primary throne candidates at the time. His eldest son, Harold, and his second son, Canute. Now, Harold was known to be a bit of a, not necessarily weak, but a bit of a soft man who preferred peace and trying to restructure the realm rather than continue an aggressive foreign policy, while as Canute has become known as sort of the last sort of real great Viking king, the last one to truly try to reestablish the Viking lifestyle, if under a Christian sort of veneer, and the Viking empires that his ancestors have created. However, since the king was an elective position at the time, the choice had to be made by the magnates of Denmark at the time, and seeing as they felt that Canute would probably not quite do as much as they wanted, while they felt they could control Harold, at Viborg Ting, or gathering in 1076, they elected Harold to be the king of Denmark and all of her domains. Harold ruled for 4 years and is known in prosperity as Harold the Soft. So, as you can imagine, he is not one of the kings that was sort of remembered as a powerful or really efficient ruler, though it's worth noticing that he did perform a very important job in standardizing weight and measures within the Kingdom of Denmark, which of course led the foundation for, well, a later development of a, shall we say, non-feudal economy and the rise of the merchant classes. which is in any country, of course, a prerequisite for the development of the modern state. However, Harold himself was, as the magnates had expected, totally dependent on him and really didn't do very much. He sat at home for the 4 years of his reign without having any children, without doing anything really important, until he died at the age of 40 in 1080 AD. At this point, there was no real choice but to elect his brother Canute as king of Denmark. And Canute immediately decided now was the time to reconquer England, because that's what Danish kings did if they had nothing better to do with their time. There are some indications that Canute might have already led some Viking raids against England during the early years of William the Conqueror's reign, and perhaps his son William Rufus, but none of them would of course have come to any really great thing, as, well, after the Normans, the Vikings wasn't really heard from again. But like I said, there are some indications that Canute might have led some Viking raids. However, as soon as he became king, he proved himself very ambitious and very devout, by the way. He enhanced the authority of the church and demanded very strict observation of religious holidays and so on. He also gave large gifts to various churches around the realm. It is worth noticing that my particular town is actually first mentioned in 1084 in a gift letter to the Lund Archbishopric Church. So that's how we know that my town is about, at this point, 940-ish years old at the very least. Of course, this aggrandizement of the church did, of course, serve to create him a very powerful ally. It also, however, to a certain degree, alienated him even more from the local magnates, who felt that by improving the power of the church, he limited their power. He also raised taxes to a very high degree in order to pay for the great navy he was developing in order to, as I said, conquer England, which was, after all, his great foreign ambition. Despite only lukewarm support from his noblemen, he did manage to gather up his great fleet in the north of Jutland. However, instead of sending it to England, Canute had to go south to the Duchy of Schleswig in order to deal with a threat from the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, because Denmark had become sort of on friendly terms with him, and Canute feared an invasion because one of Henry's enemies has sought refuge in Denmark. That didn't come to anything, but it meant that he had to disperse his fleet without actually making a crack at England. Of course, the reason he thought he could have England was because he was the great nephew of Canute the Great, while William the Conqueror was some weird sort of usurper who took what Canute considered his lawful birthright. Intending to regather the fleet the year after, Canute did another raising of taxes and put down a couple of noblemen who spoke against him. And eventually he then ordered the fleet to reassemble. However, at this point, a peasant revolt, tired of the high taxes and the time they had to spend doing nothing in military service that didn't lead to anything, then did a rebellion. Canute was in the area where there was rebellion, so at once he fled the area and tried to gather an army. However, he didn't have much luck with that, as he was, as I said, on fairly bad foot with a lot of his magnates. So eventually he was cornered in Odense, where he sought refuge in the St. Albans Priory Church. However, the rebels stormed the church and slew Canute along with his brother Benedict, another son, of course, of Sven Estrithsen, and 17 of their followers right before the altar. This would eventually lead to Canute being the first official Danish saint about 15 years later. However, in this particular case, he was primarily sainted for being killed in a church, and of course for supporting the church as he did, because otherwise he was not really a saint in any meaningful shape or fashion. However, this then caused the death of Canute, and since he didn't have any children either, he was succeeded by his brother Olaf. Now, Olaf didn't have Canute's foreign ambition, so this was basically when you can say the Viking era was finally over. The year 1086. Canute might have sort of tried to re-establish the Viking regime, but after him, no one actually gave it a go, and Denmark and most of the north eventually became sort of transformed into a standard, if you will, European-style realm monarchy with the same kind of culture and, how to put it, way of life than most of the rest of Europe. Now, Olaf wasn't necessarily a bad king. In fact, there is no real evidence that he performed any kind of misrule or anything. However, Denmark was suffering from severe crop failures and famines in this year, and it lasted practically all of Olaf's 9 years on the throne. Some said it was a punishment sent by God for the sacrilege of killing Canute inside a church, and some historians have claimed that it was maybe possible because it was a particularly Danish thing at the time. However, there does seem to be evidence that there was crop failures and problems with agriculture all over Europe at the current time. However, the wealthy grew thin and the poor died of starvation, is as the tale goes at the time. It became so bad that when the Wends, a pagan people on the north coast of what is today Eastern Germany and Poland, murdered one of his most powerful noblemen, Olaf could not even muster an army or a fleet to go avenge him, simply because there wasn't any food to feed them or any warriors to spare from the fields in order to create that army. Olaf then eventually died in the 18th of August 1095, after about 9 years on the throne, and he's one of the few kings of Denmark that we don't actually know how he died. There are some speculations that he might have committed suicide or was actually ritually sacrificed on behalf of his people to sort of relieve the burden of Denmark. Saxo Grammaticus, the famous historian, writes that he willingly gave himself to lose the land of its bad luck and beget all the guilt that should then fall on his own head. He is also the only Danish monarch in historical times where we don't actually know where he's been buried. So indication is that he might actually has, done something about it in order to try to stop that particular famine that was a mainstay of his time, so much that even today he's known as Olaf Hunger. He was then followed by his brother Eric, because yet again, no living sons. Now, Olaf, as I said, was known as Olaf the Hunger. Eric is remembered as Eric the Good, or Eric the Forever Good. So, as you can imagine, he was a less hated king, or at least Denmark had improved the situation tremendously. He had been a strong supporter of Canute the Holy, the one that was killed in the church, but he was spared during the rebellion. Primarily because he apparently remained at the royal farm and talked to the rebels instead of fleeing away, so they had a certain degree of respect for him. Now, when Eric became king, the famine sort of slowly subsided, and Eric spent most of his realm rebuilding the strength and the, just coherency of the Kingdom of Denmark. He had a reputation for being very ruthless to robbers and pirates who had become endemic at the time, and while probably attempting to a certain degree rebuild strong centralized government, he understood that after the chaos of the last 10-15 years or so, it was more important that the country as a whole was simply rebuilt. So he acted as a diplomat by supporting his various nobles in order to just create a sort of greater control of the areas with respect for law and order and so on. Now, Eric definitely had children. Particularly, he had one legitimate son called Canute Lavard. I will get back to Canute Lavard later, so remember this name. He also had two other sons, one Harold Kesha and one other son called Eric. Eric will be another king of Denmark later, so again, we will get back to Eric the Good's children later. However, despite him being so popular and actually a fairly decent king, unfortunately he managed to get drunk at one of his own feasts and apparently managed to get offended by something that happened and killed some of his own men. Now, in order to purge himself of the guilt, he promised to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And despite the pleading of his people and his magnates, who felt like he was probably the best king they could have at the time, he would not be dissuaded, and with his queen set out for Jerusalem. However, while at Constantinople, he became very ill, and despite this took ship for Cyprus. However, he died there in July of 1103. Now, as I said, Eric had sons. However, the Danish monarchy was still elective at the time, and since his children were young and not particularly well placed to become kings, eventually they, and by they of course mean the Danish nobles, chose his younger brother and the youngest son of Sven Estridsen, Niels, as the new king. Now, with Niels, there came a good bit of, how to put it, stability to the rule of Denmark. He lasted for 30 years, longer than, well, really any of his ancestors since Gorm the Old and Harold and Sven Twiskæg, and longer than a lot of his successors, honestly. And during practically all that time, the country had mostly internal peace. The local chronicles or contemporary chronicles describe him as mild, forthcoming, friendly, noble, and everything, if not a particularly strong and necessarily competent ruler. He was also sort of the one who performed some military reforms that turned the personal bodyguard or Nordic Hird into a sort of separate military and administrative branch, creating therefore the sort of foundations for the later professional armies and civil service of the Kingdom of Denmark. Under Niels, the Kingdom of Denmark had recreated its peace and prosperity to a certain degree that he could once again do some campaigning against the Wends that I mentioned earlier by allying with Poland, and did eventually avenge the death of the nobleman that had been killed earlier. He also managed in 1125 to have his son Magnus named as King of Sweden, so he must have had some influence. The problem started in 1130 when Magnus was driven from Sweden and had to return to his father in Denmark. At this point, Magnus the Strong, became involved in a sort of struggle or power struggle or whatever you want to call it with his cousin Canute Lavard. Canute, as I mentioned, was the son of Erik Evergood, and he was the most powerful nobleman in Denmark at the time as the Duke of Southern Jutland. He was incredibly popular both amongst the nobility and amongst the sort of ordinary people. His name basically means the bread giver, so he is obviously someone who, if he didn't actually court popularity, at least knew how to obtain it by creating himself very popular with the common folk. Niels and Magnus suspected that Canute planned to make himself king over Magnus once Niels was dead, or perhaps even raise a rebellion and make himself king before Niels died. So they lured him, or really lured him or lured him not. They got him to a party at King Niels' hall, and when he arrived, Magnus ambushed him in a nearby forest and murdered him. This then was precisely basically what he shouldn't have done, especially since his father Niels then after a bit of waffling decided to support his son and condone the murder of one of his own dukes and in fact his own nephew. This led to about 4 years, the last 4 years of Niels's reign, being one constant civil war against the supporters of Canute and his brothers, who of course led the fight against Niels and Niels's own troops. Niels had great support and power in Jutland, while his opponents controlled most of Sealand, where they were allied with the incredibly powerful noble family of the Whites, and in the old Danish core lands of southern Sweden. The civil war came to a head at the Battle of Fordevik, where Niels and Magnus lost to the alliance of Canute's brothers and other supporters. Magnus was killed and Niels tried to flee to the Holy Roman Emperor Lothar. Unfortunately, to get there, he tried to slip past the city of Slesvig. Slesvig was the greatest and most important Danish city in the southern Jutland Peninsula. It was also, however, Canute's old seat of his dukedom and seat of power. And while Niels tried to bluff his way through the city, the burghers raised up, chopped his head off, and threw him into the sea. It was, of course, at this point that Sven Estridson's sons stopped being kings of Denmark after 60 years and 5 different sons, and Niels' second nephew and Canute's younger brother, Erik, became king. Erik, the new king, had earlier been known as Erik Harefoot because he had been known from running away from various battles earlier in the Civil War. However, after the resounding victory at Fordevik, he was then given the nickname The Memorable, because, it's a lot easier to make sure you get such a name when you win rather than when you lose. His brother, Harald Kescher, one of the other brothers of Canute, returned to Denmark, and the two brothers set out to order the kingdom under their new dynastic rulership. Everything sort of went fine in the beginning, however. Erik and Harald was known to be fairly harsh to the people who had supported Niels in the old days, while truly giving large gifts and grants of power to the people who had supported himself. What he did manage to do was try to get his brother Canute Lavar made into a saint, and he spent a lot of money in trying to basically establish the divine rights of kings with himself as ultimate tyrant. In order to expand his realm, Erik led a crusade against the pagan population of the Baltic island of Rügen and managed to conquer it and its capital of Arkona. However, this, of course, again needed a raising of taxes and a bunch of people to do military service. And considering that he came in to govern after a prolonged period of civil war, it did not exactly endear him to the population, and only 3 years after his ascension to the throne, at a major gathering in Jutland, Erik was struck down during the noblemen's meeting by a local nobleman, Black Plough. He basically came up to Erik, noticed that he didn't wear his mail shirt, and pushed his spear through his belly. King Erik's nephew, another Erik, then stepped up in order to perhaps defend his uncle or try to avenge him on Black Plough, but Black Plough then told him, "Stay your hand, young Erik. A juicy fruit might have just fallen into your hand." By which, of course, he established that Erik's enemies would support his nephew as King of Denmark, and thus the civil war that was brewing was avoided, and the nephew Erik Lamb, as in baby sheep, became king. Erik was the son of one of Canute Lavard and Erik the Memorable's sisters, and he was king for about 8 years, in which he became known as a very pious and kind and actually very, very, very decent king who won a few civil wars against people who thought, well, they could be better kings. But as you can imagine at this point, there was a lot of descendants of various previous kings who all thought that, well, this should be me. And in 1146, when Eric for some reason abdicated, as by the way the only Danish king in history, and died a year later in the convent that he went into, things starting going badly. So now, after all these brothers, nephews, and so on of Sven Estridsson had been on the throne, we get to the civil war that sort of was the whole point. Now, Eric the Memorable had a son called Sven. He then, after the death of Erik Lam, his cousin, became king. However, you remember King Niels and his son Magnus, who lost at Fodevik. Magnus too had a son called Canute. He was also elected king of Denmark by some other magnates and became Canute V. Haha! 2 kings. However, things are getting better because Canute Lavard, as of course his death caused the whole damn thing, also had a son named Valdemar. And while Valdemar didn't sort of immediately cast his lot into the ring, he was supported by a large number of other magnates, and after a few years, he of course also decided that, well, if we need a king of Denmark, it might as well be me, because I'm a good guy and my father was very popular. So now we had a 3-king civil war. Now, despite Valdemar throwing his hat into the ring, or his helmet, as the case may be, the primary pretenders were still Sven and Canute, and the first many years of the Civil War was basically those two against each other, with Valdemar supporting Sven and actually agreed to give up the sort of claim as a king in order to receive his father's old title as Duke of Schleswig. The Sven was supported by the magnates of Zealand, while Canute was supported by the magnates of Jutland, and they fought as I said, several battles against each other until finally Sven managed to defeat Canute on Zealand in order to confine him to Jutland. However, Sven was not powerful enough to actually get to Jutland and defeat him there to claim the overlordship. Eventually, in order to gain support from the Holy Roman Empire, which both kings felt was necessary in order to gain the upper hand over their opponents, the Sven and Canute united in order to join yet another crusade against the Wends. The famous Wendish crusade that actually managed to Christianize most of the Baltic coastline. However, as Sven engaged the Wends in a naval battle, he felt that he received very little support from Canute, and while he won his battle, he actually lost his flagship. So, returning on to Denmark, the civil war was almost immediately reignited. However, this time Sven had more luck. He managed to conquer Funen and parts of Jutland, and finally did set Valdemar up as Duke of Schleswig as he promised, and sent Canute into exile in 1150. About a year later, Canute tried to re-enter the Denmark with German mercenaries, but was repulsed by the Sven-Valdemar alliance. Things were looking good for Sven, and when the Holy Roman Empire, tired of this constant struggle on its northern borders, brokered a deal between the various pretenders, that deal did make Sven as premier king, the first king, with Canute sort of to receive some holdings in Jutland as a king, but as Sven's vassal and co-equal ruler to Valdemar. However, Sven then declined to actually give Canute what Canute thought he was worth, and started acting as, well, his contemporaries claimed he was a bit of a tyrant at this point, because he felt he won and had support of Germans, and thus became more pro-German than pro-Danish, it was felt. However, most of these contemporaries actually wrote after the end of the civil wars, when a clear victor had been described. So, however, because people didn't like what Sven was doing, Canute then suddenly allied with Valdemar, and yet again made war on Sven, and defeated him a couple of times, and confined him to Zealand. Canute and Valdemar then made an agreement to rule Denmark as co-kings, and their united armies invaded Sealand and forced Sven to flee to his allies in Germany when his own noblemen abandoned him to join the Jutland forces. 3 years later, allied with some of the most powerful German noblemen, Sven then returned with a German army. However, at this time, the Danish magnates and noblemen were getting rather tired of the whole thing and the constant fighting between the three pretenders to the throne. So they forced through an agreement where Denmark was basically divided into 3, namely Jutland and Funen, Sealand and the islands, and the old Danish core territories in southern Sweden, Scania. Sven, as the primary throne pretender, was allowed to choose first and choose Scania. After him, Canute chose Sealand and the islands, and Valdemar was left king of Funen and Jutland. Yes, finally, peace and prosperity. And in order to celebrate this, the 3 kings held a joint feast in the city of Roskilde, where the powerful bishopric was located on Sealand, in order to seal their pact and enjoy and, celebrate this uniting and forever peace that was going to come in the Danish territories. As you can imagine from the title of this particular video, things did not go super well, because during the feast, when everyone was good, nice, and drunk, well, Sven decided to go all red wedding on basically everyone else, and had his men enter the hall, set fire to the hall, and then try to kill everyone inside of it. They did manage to get Canute killed, but Valdemar, with some friends and allies, though wounded, managed to escape from the hall. Soon after this, he then, who thought himself now as, well, now we have to finish this once and for all, married Canute's half-sister and gained a lot of Canute's old support, and then raised an army, engaged Sven several times, and finally, later the same years, at the Battle of the Grey Heath, defeated him, drove him to escape, where he was eventually murdered by a peasant, Sven that is. Valdemar thus became true king of Denmark, and it is his descendants that still actually rules the country today. Well, that was it. Basically 80 years of Danish history where, as you can imagine, the virility of one king who managed to create a bunch of chaos and struggles until finally, after a party where people tried to murder each other, they finally managed to settle things. I hope this was not too confusing. If it was, at least I hope it was amusingly confusing. And, well, I will probably return, of course, to Danish history eventually again, since it is it's a thing near and dear to my heart. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all